At the start of 1917, there was a kind of semi-lull on the Western Front, broken only by the horrors of gas warfare. I received orders to report to a special training centre where medical officers for frontline troops were shown how to detect poison gas, how to ascertain the nature of the gas, and how to give first aid to gas casualties. An officer from the Chemical Warfare Corps gave a resume of the history of gas warfare. Poison gas had already been used by the ancient Chinese to kill or disable their enemies, and in the Middle Ages a type of gas bomb would be hurled over the walls of fortresses under siege. In 1914, the French army introduced rifle grenades containing poison gas, and they were the first to use gas at Verdun in February 1916. For their part, in 1915, the Germans blew gas from large containers over enemy lines near Ypres. However, sometimes the wind would change and the gas would come back to afflict the would-be assailants. Later, territory behind the enemy's forward lines would be bombarded with shells containing deadly gas. In every trench, battery, camp and crossroads, sentries were posted to raise the gas alarm by ringing bells or hammering on metal sheets. Everyone had to keep his gas mask ready wherever he was, in bed or on the lavatory. The beards, which some of my colleagues insisted on growing, had to come off as they prevented an airtight seal with the mask. Even our horses had gas masks, and carrier pigeons were kept in gas-proof containers. Another officer gave us a lecture on the chemical composition of the various types of poison gas. However, I must confess that I hardly understood any of it. One can hardly be expected to make a detailed chemical analysis on the front line. The medical officers carried small strips of test paper, which changed colour according to the presence of this or that gas. Some gases were heavier than air, and they settled in the bottom of the trenches or valleys, and seeped into the dugouts and cellars. Others clung to the walls of the houses, only slowly evaporating and exuding deadly fumes for days. The treatment of gas casualties was chiefly concerned with the elimination of the poison from the lungs, bloodstream and skin. The various different gases were either fired separately or simultaneously to refine things. According to their contents, the shells would fly over bearing white, blue, green or yellow crosses, and containing gaseous, powder or liquid substances. Our task was to administer oxygen to remove the oily gases from the skin. Left untreated, they would produce blisters as well as deep wounds, often right to the bone. A minute drop in the eye could easily produce blindness, quite apart from almost unbearable pain. There was a duty rota system amongst the MOs attached to the artillery battalions, and we had to take it in turns to man a first aid post right in the middle of the batteries themselves. This forward dressing station was in the cellar of a raised house. A few wooden beams lay on top of the ceiling, but it was obvious that they offered hardly any protection against a high-explosive shell. These murderous weapons showed no respect for the small Red Cross flag hanging at the entrance to the cellar. As CO, I had the privilege of sleeping on a blood-drenched stretcher instead of on dirty straw. I was past caring. There were about half a dozen orderlies and stretcher-bearers in the cellar, but it was strictly forbidden by army regulations for me to mix with them. This was a pity, as I wanted to socialize with them very much. So instead of that, I became bored stiff. The only thing I could do in the semi-dark cellar was to play patience, until the cards became dog-eared and I became fed up. In the meantime, our dinner menu remained constant. It was either noodle soup or stewed horsemeat with barbed wire entanglement. One morning, a messenger arrived and told us that an ammunition dump of mixed gas containers in a battery position had received a direct hit. The shells were still exploding and had been already causing carnage. Liquid gas was pouring out and had caused heavy casualties among the men and their officers, including the divisional commander and his aide-de-camp, who were just on a tour of inspection. We put on our steel helmets, grabbed cases full of bandages, splints, remedies for local application against the sticky gas, and syringes for injecting morphine, and ran to the scene. Enemy artillery fire together with the mass of exploding German gas shells had turned the place into a veritable inferno. When we arrived with gas masks over our faces, we were sweating so heavily that we could hardly see through the steamed-up goggles of our masks. Their filters had become almost red-hot, and they no longer protected our lungs. A dead soldier lay close by, and as he did not need his gas mask any longer, I took it from his face and put it on my own. We had first to protect our own hands with bandages and special gloves, for without these we could not touch the wounded soldiers. Duly gloved, we brought the casualties to comparative safety behind a low earth wall. Among them was the general, bleeding from his arm. I applied field dressings and splints, dropped soothing liquid into the eyes of the screaming gunners, and gave morphine injections without caring very much for the sterility of the soldier's skin or of the syringe. All the time shells were bursting around us, and to make matters worse, wooden boxes of gunpowder caught fire and produced thick smoke, out of which yard-long jets of flame would shoot to envelop us. A giant sergeant was one of my most untiring and fearless helpers. Time and again he would carry a wounded soldier to us, but then his luck ran out, and a shell splinter hit him in the back. He dropped flat with a casualty in his arms, and we dragged both men towards us. Tearing off his tunic, I put a field dressing over his wound. That was all I could do for him at that moment. He tried to get up, but could not move his legs anymore. He noticed he had lost all sense of feeling in them. Diagnosis: shell splinter severing the spinal cord. The artillery observers on the enemy side must have seen the dense smoke, and now the shelling intensified. We pressed ourselves flat to the ground, always hoping that the next shell would miss us. In the far distance we could hear the boom of the guns, and after a few seconds the shell would arrive, whining, before exploding near us with a huge bang. We would then be showered by pieces of hard earth and splinters of shrapnel. At last the bombardment eased. The men with lighter wounds limped back to our dressing station, leaning against each other, with the fitter supporting the more severely wounded. We had to carry or drag the more serious cases over the fields full of shell holes. In fact, these craters proved a real blessing, because as soon as the French artillery observers saw any movement, they sent over yet more fire, and the holes afforded us some refuge. At our dressing station we tore off the soldiers' uniforms, which were soaked with liquid gas. As far as our very limited supplies allowed, we washed their bodies. After this they were bandaged properly and bedded down onto straw. Each man was injected with tetanus antitoxin, and a large T was written on his forehead in indelible pencil to warn any other doctors not to repeat the injection, as this might have had serious consequences. Like Cain in the Bible, even the general had his forehead marked. I soon ran out of morphine. At my disposal I had 2 half-empty bottles of oxygen, so I could work out exactly how long they would last. Now the lung gas began to work, and the men started to cough and gasp for breath. I sent one of my stretcher-bearers to the rear to fetch morphine, oxygen, and dressing materials. The cellar was lit by one candle, and by its light I had to relieve the seriously wounded with the one and only catheter. I quietly thanked the Franciscan monk in St. Quentin who had initiated me in its use. Ambulances and pongee carts could not get through the incessant artillery barrages. Only stretcher-bearers could make it on foot with oxygen and drugs. There were at least 18 casualties in the small cellar in which I operated, amongst them the divisional commander. His aide-de-camp had been killed, and to make more room in our cramped hole, I decided to send the walking wounded to the rear, accompanied by 2 of my stretcher-bearers. This created another difficulty. We had removed the gas-soiled uniforms and underwear from most of the soldiers to keep our cellar free from lethal gas. Thus they were completely naked. We gave a blanket to each of them, and I lent the general my greatcoat. So His Excellency departed, complete with elegant riding boots. Some days later a note of thanks arrived, together with my coat, advising me that he himself had recommended me for the Iron Cross First Class. This left us with about 10 badly wounded men, and my few helpers were untrained and quite inexperienced in this kind of work. The brave sergeant with the shell splinter in his spinal cord lay quiet and composed, although he realized fully what faced him, even were he to survive. He told me his story, which I am sure was typical of thousands of soldiers across all the fighting forces. He was about 35 years old, had practiced as a solicitor in a small town in northern Germany, and it was his sense of patriotism which compelled him to volunteer. He had fought in the East and the West, sustained wounds on 2 occasions, and had been looking forward to going on leave. His wife was expecting their 4th child. He showed me a photograph of his family, such as one would have found in the wallets of hundreds of thousands of German, British and French soldiers. I consoled him as best I could, but he told me frankly he did not believe a word of what I said. It took almost 2 days before 2 motor ambulances defied the artillery barrage and arrived to remove the wounded. Our post was absolutely denuded of drugs, water, food, and even candles. All our blankets had been given to our naked soldiers, so all we had to keep us warm were our greatcoats, which in my case was non-existent. At last, after another 10 days, a medical officer arrived to relieve me. When I returned to my battalion, I inquired about the fate of the patients I had been looking after in our small cellar. Some of them had been dispatched to special gas treatment hospitals, but 3 had died, one of them the sergeant with the severed spinal cord. I undertook to write to his widow and tell her about the heroism of her late husband. My advance first aid station near Hill 60 in Flanders, which the Germans called the Kemmel, was in a small dugout, reached through a deep valley. German and British casualties filled this station, which was suddenly bombarded with gas shells by the enemy. In contrast to high explosives, the gas containers broke with a dull thud and not with a sharp bang. The fumes started to drift in our direction, and the gas alarm was given. After putting on our gas masks, we found that most of the British prisoners had thrown theirs away. We had a few to spare, but not nearly enough for all the British, so we packed them like sardines into our dugout and closed up the entrance with greatcoats and blankets. Several improvised tubes, which we had fitted with gas filters, were pushed into the space as breathing holes. To seal the entrance, we wetted it with the only liquid at our disposal, namely urine. After about half an hour, a breeze sprang up and drove the poisonous gas away. We removed the blankets and greatcoats with heavy hearts, fearing that our British guests would have suffocated, but they were all alive and none the worse for their incarceration. Part of my duties consisted of visiting various smaller units which directly or indirectly belonged to my battalion. I made my rounds on horseback. Having seen my patients, I was often invited in for a drink of ersatz coffee, a glass of beer or wine, or even a schnapps. Towards evening I was mighty glad that my horse found its way back without any guidance from me. The job of men I visited was to locate the enemy batteries by measuring distance by the speed of sound. Others had to look for the gun flashes of the enemy artillery and then pinpoint their position using trigonometry. Some signallers were deployed to crawl on their bellies at night through the barbed wire entanglements in front of or behind the enemy trenches. Once in position, they buried copper plates about 1 square foot in size. Wires connected to these plates picked up what was being said over the telephone by the enemy and sent the sound to our amplifiers. Those conducting these nightly expeditions were exposed to great danger, and I had to be in the forward trenches with stretcher-bearers immediately available. All kinds of diversions were used to distract the enemy sentries' attention from the spot where the copper plates were being dug in. Sometimes even mock attacks were staged to deceive them. The commanding officer of these special detachments initiated me into the secrets of their work. One listening post had a man who had lived in France for many years and was completely conversant with various French dialects. He discovered that one French colonel would speak with his counterpart in another unit at a certain time every day. They would discuss troop movements and the installation of new batteries. Our man nicknamed him Chatterbox. Apparently, French intelligence had no inkling of Colonel Chatterbox's loose talk, even though he seemed to give away secrets all the time. On the other hand, German signallers coded their messages, and the meaning of the words they used was changed on a daily basis. I received a message at a certain time advising me that wolves would be howling. This was code for telling me that fresh supplies of bandages had just arrived, whereas the same message the previous day would have meant that our large trench mortars were about to open fire. Later, near Ypres, I found that the British not only insulated their telephone wires securely, but took care to place them at least 1.5 inches above the ground to discourage wiretapping. By means of these devices, however, the Germans found out that the French command was planning a mighty offensive on the Aisne, along a part of the front known as the Chemin des Dames. Naturally, the German High Command had other sources to confirm the enemy's intentions, and made counter-attack preparations accordingly. Whole regiments of engineers arrived in our sector. They converted every house and barn in the area into soldiers' sleeping accommodation without changing the outer appearance of the buildings. Hay and straw were cleared out from the barns, and several floors connected by staircases were built in. Innumerable rolls of wire netting were arranged to make hammock-like sleeping accommodation. No man was allowed to leave his quarters in daylight, and from the air the villages looked as if they were deserted. Guns and ammunition were only brought into position at night. They were camouflaged immediately, and the gunners went back to their barracks. Even the cart tracks were levelled out and covered with leaves and shrubs. We were only allowed to move around in the hours of darkness, and I am sure that the French reconnaissance aircraft saw no sign of the increased activity on our side. The German command not only knew the date of the planned offensive, but also the exact time the French infantry were to go over the top. About an hour before this time, the French artillery was expected to bombard the German front-line positions, so these were vacated by the infantry, and only a few sentries were left behind. During the night, the German gunners made their preparations. Precisely 10 minutes before the massed French soldiers were due to attack, the German guns and mortars opened up with everything they had, causing terrible carnage in the overflowing enemy trenches. Each and every French gun emplacement had been located by German reconnaissance aircraft, and by equipment which measured distance by the speed of sound. The French artillery was now kept under sustained and heavy fire, resulting in their return of fire becoming more sporadic and inaccurate. In spite of the obvious failure of his badly concealed and equally badly executed offensive, General Nivelle, the French commander-in-chief, insisted on sticking to his plan. He drove his troops and reserves into the hail of German steel. German artillery observers told me how the French troops were pushed forward like lambs to the slaughter. With an awful predictability, they were blown to bits by the heavy and medium German shells. The observers really pitied them. In the meantime, German reconnaissance aircraft took low-level photographs showing the French forward positions ploughed up by our shells and littered with human bodies. Patrols reported that they could not move without treading on dead soldiers. Only a very few were still alive, and orders were given to send doctors and medical orderlies to save as many as possible. Like the British at La Bassée, we went forward waving Red Cross flags, but we had barely covered half the distance between the German and French lines when the French artillery opened up, wounding several German stretcher-bearers. The French commanders must have gone crazy, because they then began a systematic bombardment of their own trenches containing the few French survivors. The whole bloody affair was apparently too much for the French troops, and entire army corps mutinied and refused to continue the offensive. It has been said that between Reims and Paris, no more than 2 reliable French divisions remained, while the others staged a sit-down strike. The French army had lost about 100,000 men during the first 24 hours of the offensive, and the soldiers called their general Le Buveur du Sang the blood drinker. It took about 5 weeks for the artillery duels to die down, and during that time the heavy howitzers of my battalion went into action again and again. My CO was from Strasbourg in Alsace, and he happened to be a very superstitious man. He had brought a large Alsatian dog with him, which he regarded as a kind of mascot. As long as this dog was present, he was convinced that no harm would befall him. However, the dog disappeared one day, and the whole battalion was ordered to look for him. Even though we looked everywhere, and the field telephones got busy, there was no trace of him to be found. The major, a tall, good-looking man, became morose and disconsolate, even though he was usually a resolute and tough individual. He spoke about his impending death, he could not sleep, and I had to give him sleeping pills. Then he began drinking, and I frequently found him drunk, something he would never have tolerated among his subordinates. 3 weeks went by and still no sign of the wretched dog. The major had to inspect a battery position and asked me to accompany him. Though contrary to regulations, he went without his steel helmet. When the sound of an incoming shell was heard, we raced into a ditch and I shouted to him to fling himself to the ground. The shell burst, showering me with earth. I found my CO lying on the ground with his head torn open and his brains hanging out. He was still breathing, but the size and nature of his wound told me there was really no hope for him. I put a field dressing round his head and ran to the nearest post. but when I returned with a stretcher party, the Major was dead. Doubtless it was a coincidence, but his superstition or premonition had actually come true. We took his body back to Battalion HQ, and I placed him in a hastily made coffin. He was then taken back to his hometown of Strasbourg, where he was buried with full military honours. By the way, Sultan, my Romanian mongrel, had absconded before we were entrained for France. Perhaps he had heard of the noise on the Western Front, or that many a dog had vanished there, only to reappear in the form of a fricassee. A few days after the death of our commanding officer, a captain was appointed to lead the battalion, a man we all knew as the commander of one of our batteries. He was a professor of my old university in Freiburg, where he taught philosophy. He was a jolly old fellow who did not mind being the target of a practical joke. A connoisseur of good drinks, he often received shipments of famous Black Forest Kirschwasser, cherry brandy, which looks like water but burns like fire. One of our young lieutenants, who was also a Freiburg graduate, had the bright idea of swapping the contents of several bottles for clean spring water. He removed the corks from the bottles with the utmost care, drained off the Kirschwasser and substituted it with water. Naturally, we drank the real schnapps with great delight before recorking the bottles, which now contained water, and replacing them in the captain's quarters. We did not have long to wait for an invitation from our captain to join him for a kind of cocktail party. With his face a picture of innocence, he served us with what looked like Kirschwasser from one bottle after another, and we too were obliged to keep our faces completely solemn, whilst praising the excellence of the schnapps. The captain himself could not suppress a twinkle in his eye when he saw all of us pretending to enjoy the stuff. He once made a bet with one of our youngest officers that the lining of the pockets of our army-issue trousers was waterproof. The greenhorn had to put on a pair, together with his riding boots, before the captain poured a whole bottle of cheap German sparkling wine or sect into the trouser pockets and roared with laughter when the riding boots overflowed. Another officer of my battalion composed a marching song called Das Ganselied, the Goose's Song, which became as popular as Lili Marleen in the Second World War. He later became the mayor of the charming little town of Meersburg on Lake Constance, the tourist destination of countless thousands of visitors. So you see, there were no sourpusses, and our lives contained their lighter side away from the sordid battle scenes and sights of death. We were still so young, and we all hoped that life would hold better things in store for us, apart from killing and maiming. The batteries and men of the battalion were taken by train to the Belgian town of Ghent, where another motorized battery of long-barreled cannon joined us. The administration of such a mass of heavy artillery had to be streamlined, and a reorganization took place which left me redundant. The batteries went into action as single units, and it proved impossible for me to be with all of them at the same time. Although I was still a member of battalion staff, I was constantly on my way from one battery to another. One of them was in action near Passchendaele in Flanders, where the battlefield was, to put it mildly, atrocious. The men sank in the mud to above their knees, the guns to their axles and the horses to their bellies. Here the British tried to break through towards Ghent and Zeebrugge, the main German U-boat base. The whole offensive got stuck in this quagmire, and the losses sustained were truly awful. 16 years later, when I went to Edinburgh, I found a statue to the British Army's Commander-in-Chief, sitting proudly on his horse, wearing long riding boots. This seemed to be the right attire for the general who lost so many men at Passchendaele, and who allegedly never went near the battlefield himself. His long boots would probably have only just kept his splendidly tailored riding breeches from getting muddy. One night I had to ride my horse over a road, which led across the morass, and which consisted merely of railway sleepers laid next to each other by Russian prisoners of war. Our column came to a halt because a heavily laden horse-drawn wagon had slid off the passageway and blocked it. Efforts were made in the pitch darkness to harness 20 horses to pull the wagon back, but these were in vain. It was decided to push it off the road completely. More shells were landing close to me, and my horse jumped around in fright. I had to keep it steady and calm it down, though I did not feel very calm myself. Red-hot shell splinters, often a foot long, hissed and flew in all directions, and I took cover behind a solid-looking wagon with my horse. At last the column started to move, and when daybreak came I saw that the wagon was fully loaded with very lights. One spark would have blown the lot sky high. Apparently my lucky star was still in the ascendant. My next journey took me to the neighbourhood of Cambrai, where the British were attacking with tanks for the first time. Our observation posts were perched on a slag heap several 100 feet high. Steep staircases with makeshift handrails led to the observers' dugouts. When the gunners opposite aimed for these posts, the whole heap turned into a thick cloud of black smoke, and the men looked like coal miners coming up to the surface after a shift down the pit. I watched the German artillery hitting the tanks and taking them out at point-blank range. This was the first attempt by the British to enclose human beings in thick steel, impenetrable to machine gun bullets. However, they would not protect them from German field artillery shells. Nonetheless, the German infantrymen almost panicked when they saw these huge steel monsters coming towards them, flattening barbed wire entanglements and rolling over deep trenches. They ran over men mercilessly, pressing them to the ground, leaving behind crushed and flattened remnants of what had been human beings just a few seconds earlier. All the poor foot sloggers could do was to throw a bunch of hand grenades under the tanks and hope they would blow up. In fact, the British had broken through the German lines, and British cavalry rode into Cambrai. However, they did not know how to consolidate their success, and shortly afterward the German counterattack followed to recover all the ground lost, plus about 10,000 prisoners of war, and many burned-out wrecked tanks. I talked with some of the British tank crews wounded in action. They spoke of their high hopes as they went into battle, which they assumed would bring decisive victory.